This video will be mainly animations of epidemics and about why there is no immunity in herd immunity. And as a strategy against epidemic, the method of herd immunity should be called the method of maximum death. So first, the meaning of R. The first estimate of R for the COVID-19 epidemic was 2.68. It's an estimate, nobody really knows, and it's a simplification. R does not depend just on the virus, it also depends on the behavior of the population that it infects. And it's a kind of average over the whole population. So R is the number of new people infected by each person who is already infected. Now this leaves something out. It doesn't take into account time. For instance, if you have an epidemic that is growing exponentially but is growing very slowly, if it takes a couple of months to pass on the virus, I don't think there are epidemics that behave that way. But anyway, if you had one like that, then even with the exponential growth, you might get it under control because you could detect and isolate all the infected people. But that's not happening with COVID-19 and with most viruses. They spread too fast. So anyway, I'm going to simplify, because you have to simplify to calculate anything, and assume that each person who gets infected will pass along the infection to our people after 1 week, and then the person who was originally infected cannot get infected again. So for instance, if you start with 10 infected people in your population, then after 1 week they pass along the infection to 25 others, and then the original 10 can't get infected again. After 2 weeks you have 63 infectious people. After the third week you have 158 infectious people. A week later 395. After 8 weeks you have 15,438. After 12 weeks you have more than 600,000 infectious people. After 16 weeks you have 23 million infectious people. So this is just going to keep going for, well, it can't go forever because eventually you run out of people to infect. What if you had a lower R value? If you get R down to 1.5, then your initial 10 people infect 15 after 1 week. They infect 23 after the next week, and then 35, 53, 270, and so on. Well, these numbers are a lot better, it looks like. We'd rather have an epidemic like that. But it's not really a lot better, because it's still exponential growth. And for instance, to get 15,000 infections, if you have R equals 2.5, it takes 8 weeks to get to 15,000 infections. With R equals 1.5, you still get to 15,000 infections. It takes 18 weeks. So it's taking more than twice as long, but it's eventually going to get everyone. Like the first one took 16 weeks to infect 23 million people. And with R equals 1.5, you'll still get to 23 million people. It will just take twice as long, or a little longer than twice as long. And finally, another example. What if R is less than 1? What if R is 0.8? And we start with 10 infected people. Then after 1 week, we'll have 8 new infections. A week later, 6 new infections. And then 5 new infections, and 4. This is just going to fizzle out on its own. Well, this is the kind of epidemic that we really want with R less than 1. If we have R less than 1, the epidemic fizzles out on its own. We can make the R value of the virus lower. The R value, as I said, is not a property of the virus alone. It also depends on the population that it infects. And what social distancing is about bringing down the R value. As people stay apart, as people don't gather together in crowds, and people wear masks, for instance, and gloves, and wash their hands, and whatever. All these things bring down the R value of the epidemic. There is a formula for calculating when the epidemic reaches a point that, well, I think it should be called the point of diminishing spread. Some people like the term herd immunity, but I think that's pretty bogus. There's no immunity in herd immunity. So the point of diminishing spread, this is when each infected person only infects one other person. assuming that people are going about their business the same as they did at the beginning. So, for instance, if R is 2, when the population are just going about their business as usual, if each person infects 2 other people, then you reach the point of diminishing spread once 50% have been infected. At that point, each person who catches the virus tries to infect 2 others. Well, the person doesn't try, the virus tries to infect 2 others. But it runs up against people who are already immune, people who've already had the virus. At that point, half the people it hits are people who are not vulnerable. So only one new person will get the virus. And if you have an epidemic that starts out with R equals 4, then the point of diminishing spread is 3/4 of the population. Once you have 75% infected, then when the virus tries to spread to 4 new people, 3 of them already have been infected, so the virus doesn't affect them. So now at last we can get to an animation. This is not really how my model is going to work, but we'll see. So each white cell represents one person who has not been infected yet. And we're starting with one red cell to represent an infectious person. This is going to be with R equals 4. So each red cell will infect the person above and to the right and to the left and below. So let's see how this infection spreads. It's pretty simple. Something that isn't obvious with R equals 4 is that this is a wraparound model. So if you go off the top edge of the diagram, you come back on at the bottom and vice versa. And if you go off at the left, you come back on at the right and vice versa. So here's another animation with R equals 2 where you can see that. So for each red cell is going to infect the white cell above it and the white cell to the right. Here's my real model. This is using R equals 2. And now everybody isn't just sitting where they are. They move around. They go about their business. And so after each week of new infections, we shuffle everyone around. So at first we start with 1 person infected. A week later there are 2 infected. It's R equals 2, so it's going to double every time. And then we have 4 infected, and then 8 infected, then 16, then 32, and then 60. What happened there? So what's happening here is that as more people get infected, the virus is running up against people who already were infected. So the epidemic stops spreading as fast. So when people talk about flattening the curve, you reach the top of the curve and then there's so many people already infected that you go down the downward sloping side of the curve. But so what about this so-called herd immunity that people like to talk about? This is R equals 2. So people who like to talk about herd immunity say that once we reach 50% already infected, everybody is safe. Well, it's not true. If you look at this simulation, we got as far as 85% of the people are infected. It didn't stop at 50. Even when you're over the point of diminishing spread, to stop an epidemic, you have to do something to stop the epidemic. For diminishing spread to really be useful, you have to be talking about a situation where nobody is infectious. And then suddenly a few infectious people show up and there's an outbreak of a virus, but it fizzles out to nothing pretty quickly. In this case, where we have an epidemic, when we reach that point of 50% infected, there's still very many people who are infectious. In this case, 184 people. That's 18% of the whole population. So the epidemic will fizzle out, but it's going to get almost everyone on its way to fizzling out. Here's another example again with R equals 2. This time with 10,000 people. And I'm not going to show the shuffling around of people after each generation. That would just slow this down too much. So if there is such a thing as herd immunity, then everybody should be safe once 50% have been infected. But no, in this simulation we get 83% infected. Here's an example with R equals 4. The point of diminishing spread should be 3/4 of the population, 75%. So people who believe in herd immunity tell us that we will be safe once 75% have had the infection. But no, this epidemic goes on to infect 99% of the population. I have a couple more animations, but I don't think I need to explain anything more about the animations. Today is April 19th, 2020. The death rate from COVID-19, we don't know. There are a lot of things we don't know. We have statistics about this. In China, it seemed like the death rate was about 4%. 4% of the people who got infected died. In Italy, it seemed like 9%. It could be higher. A lot of people who die from this disease don't get counted. They only get counted if they get tested. And people who don't die in hospital may not get counted. We have some estimates of how many people are actually dying from this disease by comparing the number of deaths in a region with the number of deaths during the same time last year. And this is one way that we know that a lot of people are dying from this that haven't been counted. There's also the issue that some people dying from COVID-19 already have other conditions. If they have a heart condition and they get COVID-19, then they die, but their death might be recorded as being caused by a heart condition instead of COVID-19. And the death rate could be lower than 4% also, because as well as not detecting all the deaths, we're also not detecting all the people who are infected. A lot of people who get infected don't get sick, and they don't go to a doctor, they don't get tested, and we don't know how many of those people there are. The good news is, well, it's sort of good news that probably there are more of those people, and the death rate is lower than 4%. Although that's also sort of bad news because it means that the virus spreads faster than we thought. I said near the beginning that the first estimate for the R value of this epidemic, while people go about their business normally, is R equals 2.68. But if there are a lot more uninfected people, if there are a lot more infected people who aren't getting detected, then that means the virus is actually spreading more than we realize. It has a higher R number, and it's going to be harder to control. Something else I should mention about my models. Okay, you're going to say if 4% or 9% or whatever the percentage is, if that percentage die, then in my models, 4% or 9% of these blue people shuffling around should be dead. Yes, it's true. I guess my model has zombies in it. So, that's just how it is. Pay no attention to the zombies. Zombies are the least of our problems at this time. Something important to bear in mind about COVID-19 is that how sick you get may depend on the amount of the virus that you get infected with at the start when you get infected. This happens with some other viruses. This is called viral loading. And because of this, you can't completely eliminate the risk of getting infected, it seems. But because of this phenomenon, frequent hand washing and wearing masks and gloves and so on can benefit you, because if you do come into contact with the virus, you'll get less of it. Some people seem to think young people aren't affected by the virus. Really? Where is that news? You won't find any news stories that say that young people aren't affected. The news is that young people probably won't die from this virus, but young people can get sick, and everyone who's had COVID-19 seems to say it's terrifying during the phase when you are breathing and suffocating at the same time. So try not to get this disease. As for treating COVID-19, doctors seem to be treating the worst cases of COVID-19 for pneumonia using the same textbook treatments for pneumonia that have been used for decades. But lately some doctors are saying that this pneumonia seems different. They're treating people with ventilators. And the bad news, well, sort of bad news about this is that the majority of people who are put on ventilators die anyway. I don't think this news has been mentioned as much as it should be. And it's quite an unpleasant way to die. You get the worst things I've read about this, so you get a tube stuck down your windpipe. And one doctor said everybody who's had this treatment had to be physically restrained because it feels like you're getting choked when this pipe goes down your throat. And if you are put on a ventilator, even if you survive, you're very likely to have damage to your lungs. All of a sudden, it's April 24th. A few weeks ago, there were projects about amateur-made ventilators, but from what I've seen of these projects, it looks like the people who are making these haven't really looked into what's necessary in a ventilator for use in a hospital. Real Engineering made a very good video about what's wrong with these ventilators. A couple of other points, though, that he missed in that video. One thing is that the gas that you get in a ventilator probably comes from, usually it has to be a higher oxygen than ordinary air. So you're getting oxygen from pressurized cylinders. When gas is released from a pressurized cylinder, its temperature drops. So you would be getting cold gas into your lungs, and you don't want to do that. And it's going in through a plastic pipe. Normally, when air enters your lungs, it goes through your nose, and it has some minimum humidity and warmth because of that. But that doesn't happen when you're on a ventilator, and air or oxygen going into your lungs is going through this tube. Another thing, in that video, he talks a bit about how bad it is to be on a ventilator, and sometimes the patient has to be paralyzed. The patient is injected with drugs, so the patient is completely paralyzed and is not able to breathe on his own. And he says that's a particularly damaging way to be on a ventilator. And if someone has to be in that condition, you don't want that condition to last any longer than it really has to. Even if it's normally a bad idea for patients to be paralyzed with drugs, to be put on a ventilator, there's some talk of maybe doing this so that you can put 2 or maybe even 4 patients on the same ventilator. There are other treatments which are less severe. There's CPAP and BiPAP. You get a breathing mask tight over your face with higher than normal air pressure so you can't fully exhale, because when you exhale and you have pneumonia, your lung tissue can stick together, and then it's hard to really inhale properly again. Another possible treatment for COVID-19 is ECMO. I don't know if it's pronounced that way. ECMO. EC is short for extracorporeal. You know what that means? It means out of body. Your blood has an out of body experience. It goes through a machine that attaches oxygen to your hemoglobin. I don't know how well this works. These machines, from what I've read, are usually only used on babies. And also this treatment seems to be only used together with a ventilator. Another possible treatment is plasma transfusions from people who have recovered from the disease to get their antibodies. This treatment has been used before for measles and for Spanish flu. If you get the virus and it gets past your lungs, it can damage other parts of your body. So doctors are saying now that it might damage your kidneys, might damage your heart. People are getting blood clots Some people lose their sense of smell. It might damage your nerves, your brain. And something related to this, some patients without enough oxygen in their blood don't act like there's anything wrong. And there was speculation that maybe patients like this can get by without ventilators, and now there's other speculation that maybe what's happening in these cases is that the virus has attacked the part of the brain that normally would detect low oxygen and make these patients feel sick and gasp for more air. And really they are just as sick as their oxygen readings indicate. Some people want to dwell on laying blame for the origin of the virus, which is the most useless possible response to the situation. It's not useful to simply say that China's unhygienic meat markets are to blame. China is not the only country with unhygienic meat markets. Epidemics can start anywhere, and the deadliest epidemic against humans that there ever was the Spanish flu, which most likely started in the USA in Kansas 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago. So after this crisis, if China is the only country that makes any changes, then everyone else is still going to be vulnerable to epidemics. All this is more or less assuming that the epidemic originated in the seafood market in Wuhan, China. There's an institute for studying viruses near the Wuhan seafood market, and it can't be ruled out that there could have been an accident that released the virus from the laboratory. There's no strong evidence for that, but the strongest suggestion that the virus might have come from the lab is that the Chinese government seems hostile to any investigation that might contradict the official explanation that the origin was an unhygienic meat market. I have a vegan friend who says that we should blame meat eaters for this epidemic. I eat meat, but his point is logical. There have been several notorious epidemics of lethal illness that came from livestock raised for meat. Flattening the curve by itself is not much better than relying on herd immunity. The best approach is to stamp out the virus completely and then go back to normal in places where the virus is eliminated, except in places that normally have tourists. And if we can't stamp out the virus completely, the best we can do is minimize the spread of the virus until a vaccine is found. I will stop talking now. Thanks for watching.